Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Just a couple things to remember. The exam is on Tuesday, so make sure that between now and the exam coming up, that you go to D2L, click Exam 2, and go over the study guide. All right, that's a very important thing to do. There's no surprises on the exam. The second exam has the exact same format as the first exam. But it's just different material. So if you go through the study guide and study all the terms and prepare an outline for part 2, you'll be in good shape. There'll be nothing that will be surprising on the exam, because the 6 terms will be on the exam will be taken directly from that list. All right, and then another thing is that next week's a busy week. We have an exam on Tuesday, and then assignment number 3 is coming up on Thursday. I think the assignment number 3 is on the I believe it's on the French Revolution. It concerns that topic. So we've already covered it in class. So assignment number 3 is due. Now that, just like with the first 2 assignments, you don't have to bring it to class. You can just you have till 11:59 on next Thursday evening, so you can just post it in the Dropbox and you're good to go. Or you can send it to me as an email attachment, whatever works best for you. But anyway, so that's coming up. So we got a busy week next week. All right, so let's go ahead and get started today. Last time we were talking about how after the 1848 revolution, the appetite of the middle class for revolution was greatly diminished. In other words, middle class folks across Europe weren't so enthusiastic about the idea of a revolution, because revolutions are messy. They are violent and bloody and uncertain, and that's something that most people don't want to deal with. So as a result, middle class people, they still believed in the ideals of liberalism, written constitutions, individual rights, representative government, elections. They still believed in those principles, and they also were very nationalistic, believed that people share a common language and a culture ought to have their own government. Yet to achieve those goals, to achieve national goals, to achieve liberal goals, they wanted it to be done in a way that was orderly and avoided chaos. And they wanted it to be done by the state, by the government. And we saw it in the case of German unification. In 1848, they had the Frankfurt Assembly. They tried to establish unified Germany, and it completely failed. But Bismarck was able to unite Germany through what, as he called it, blood and iron, through war and diplomacy. And he was able to unite all the German states. Remember, it was German unity came at the expense of France. Remember, in the Franco-Prussian War, the French were humiliated. The Napoleon III's regime collapsed, and it was in the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles, as German armies occupied France, that Germany, all the German states, recognized William of Prussia to be the Emperor of Germany, the Kaiser. That's like Caesar, Tsar in Russian is a corruption of Caesar. Well, Kaiser is a corruption of Caesar. So the not a corruption, but the German word for Caesar. So basically, what they were doing was that they were rebuilding the Holy Roman Empire under a German unified state. So that's why he assumed the title of Emperor of Germany, or Kaiser, in 1871. Now, one of the legacies of German unification was that it led to a really terrible relationship between France and Germany. And one of the stories that we'll be covering when we get back after the exam will be how this hatred between Germany and France, this desire among the French for revenge, would be one of the most driving forces behind the events leading up to World War I. So in a lot of ways, German unification sowed the seed for World War I more than 40 years later. Now, one of the reasons why the Germans annexed Alsace-Lorraine. Now granted, these areas had been part of Germany, the Holy Roman Empire, back in the Middle Ages. You know, Alsace was annexed by France in the 30 Years' War. Lorraine was only annexed by France in 1765. So both areas had only fairly recently been annexed to France, and now Germany felt they were justified to take them back. Now that the German Empire was being restored, they felt that these lands belonged to Germany, not to France. But the French never forgot that they had been humiliated and that they had been forced to give up territory that they believed was French and not German. It's Alsace-Lorraine is right on the border between the two countries along the Rhine River. Now, on top of that, another low blow for France was that 1871 marks a real low point for in the history of France. You see, right after Napoleon III fell from power, France was declared a republic, and it's called the Third Republic. The First Republic was the French Revolution, the Second Republic was in 1848. This is the Third Republic, and they called for a national assembly to write a constitution for France. And while this assembly was meeting to draft a new constitution for a Republic of France, there was a social revolution right in Paris. You see, by this time, a lot of French workers were organized into unions, and what happened in 1871 is that some of these unions, these working people, seized power in Paris, and they organized themselves into a workers' council. Now, when we get to the Russian Revolution, these workers' councils were called Soviets, but it was called a workers' council, and they declared themselves to be the legitimate government of France. And it was their vision to try to implement what Karl Marx had called for back in 1848, to create a government of the proletariat, a government of the workers, where there would be no social classes and there would be complete economic and political equality. So this workers' council seized control of Paris, and they claimed to be the legitimate government of France. The National Assembly really didn't see it that way. They felt that they were the legitimate government of France. And so what you have when you have two people claiming to represent the government of France, you're going to have a war. And so a civil war broke out. Now the army, which was dominated by middle-class officers, the army supported the National Assembly, and eventually Paris was besieged by the French forces, and about 40,000 people lost their lives in this civil war. But it was a real low, and this civil war took place at a time when German armies were occupying France. So the German armies kind of did nothing to intervene, just allowed this bloodshed to take place, figuring, well, it's a French problem, let them deal with it. And they did. Now, eventually, France did write a new constitution, and under their new constitution, they didn't want to have another revolution, so they created a constitution that called for a very strong presidency. I think under the Third Republic, the president had a 6-year term. So and Adolf Thiers became the first president of the new Third Republic of France. So even in France, there was a kind of like a fear of social revolution because they remembered what had happened in Paris. Now, believe it or not, there was another workers' council that seized power in a major city, and during the time of revolution, guess where it was? Anybody know? 1877, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Did you know that you had a socialist revolution in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1877? It's called the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. And the unions of Pittsburgh seized control of the city of Pittsburgh, and the Pennsylvania State Militia had to be called out along with federal troops to restore order and end the social revolution. There was a social revolution right here in America in the 1877 Great Railroad Strike. You don't really hear a lot about it because it wasn't a nationwide thing. Basically, it was in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia among the railroad workers. But there was, and so there was this memory. There was also a social revolution in 1873 Spain that was crushed by forces of Spain, and that brought about the restoration of the Bourbon dynasty in Spain. So there were actually these social revolutions inspired by the idea of socialism. And in fact, the Paris Commune that was organized in like the Pittsburgh Commune, People's Republic of Pittsburgh, People's Republic of Paris, it inspired the word communist, because the word because that became the idea was that communism was about, you needed to have a violent revolution to overthrow the bourgeoisie and establish the proletariat state. But anyway, so it had to be very painful for France to have to be first occupied by foreign power, then to have territory taken away from them, and then also to have your country torn apart by civil war. And you could see why the French would be very unhappy and angry at the Germans and blame the Germans. And that would plant the seeds for future conflict, the Great War, World War I. One of the causes. As we'll see, World War I had many causes. All right, now, we talked about the unification of Germany. Let's talk about the unification of Italy. Because Italy, like Germany, was unified not by assemblies or by revolution or by drafting constitutions. It was unified by war and diplomacy. Now, the architect of the unification of Italy was another great statesman, a man by the name of Cavour, Camillo di Cavour. You can see his picture up there. Now, Cavour was a very different man than Bismarck. Remember, Bismarck was a junker and an aristocrat. Cavour was a banker. He was from the upper middle class. He was from the middle class. And see, what happened is that he was from northern Italy. Now, northern Italy was one of the parts of Europe that was becoming rapidly industrialized, just like parts of Germany, like Great Britain. And he saw a future for a industrialized Italy led by the middle class. And see, the thing about the Kingdom of Sardinia is that it had a liberal constitution that wealthy middle class Italians could support, because it only gave the right to vote to the very wealthy, and that was it. Maybe just only like about 5 or 6% of the population. So you had to be pretty wealthy. Now, Camillo Cavour, coming from a family of bankers, his family was wealthy enough to vote and participate in the political process. Now, Cavour wanted to see Italy united by internationalists, like a lot of middle-class people, and he wanted to see it united under the King of Sardinia. He wanted to make his king, Victor Emmanuel, king of a united Italy. Now, Victor Emmanuel and Cavour didn't even like each other. Very different than the situation with Bismarck. They weren't friends, and the only reason why Cavour supported him is because he saw the King of Sardinia as a unifying figure, a symbolic figure that all Italians could support and unite behind. Now, Cavour learned from the lessons of history, and he knew that if he tried to unite Italy by going against Habsburg Austria all by himself, that they would lose. That they did not have the resources to defeat Habsburg Austria, because not only would they have to face Habsburg Austria, but Habsburg Austria, its constant friend and supporter was the very conservative Russian Empire under the Tsars. So he knew that if you had to go against Austria, you'd also have to go against Russia, because the two countries were strong allies, had been strong allies ever since the days of Peter the Great. But see, something changed, and what happened was the Crimean War in the mid-1850s. This Crimea is in the news a lot, but so there was a Crimean War. Now, the Crimean War was a war that pitted Russia against the Ottoman Empire. And the background for this war was the fact that Russia saw itself as the champion of all Orthodox Christians. You remember, the Tsar was the head of the Orthodox Church in their view. Now, what happened is that in 1853, there was a rebellion by the people of Moldavia and Wallachia. Now, Moldavia and Wallachia were principalities within the Ottoman Empire, where they were part of the Ottoman Empire, but the vast majority of the people who lived in Moldavia and Wallachia were Romanians. They weren't called Romanians at the time. They were called Vlachs and Moldavians. but they were Orthodox Christians. Now, when there was this uprising against the Ottoman Empire in 1853, the Ottoman Empire was going through a period of rebuilding its armed forces and kind of learning the lessons of, that the Janissaries had been a big mistake, and they had a better military, and the Ottoman Empire was able to get the best of this rebellion. But the Russians decided that they could not sit still and see fellow Christians butchered by the Ottoman Empire. And also, they wanted to annex these areas. They wanted to expand their empire. So in 1854, war broke out between the Ottoman Empire and Russia, and it's called the Crimean War. Now, this is what happened, though. Napoleon III, he decided that this was the perfect opportunity to assert French domination of the continent. He was tired of Russia having all the limelight. And Napoleon III wanted to project this image, just like his uncle's image, of being the defender of nationalism and liberalism. And since Russia was the most conservative of all nations in Europe, Napoleon III saw in the Crimean War an opportunity for France to expand itself, to assert its influence, and weaken Russia, and make Napoleon, of course, Napoleon III wanted to make himself look good as well. Now, Great Britain also was concerned about this war because they were afraid that if the Russians won the war and the Ottoman Empire was further weakened, then that would create instability in the Near East. And remember, the Near East was Great Britain's lifeline to the jewel of the British Empire, that would be India. So when the Crimean War broke out, France and Great Britain, even though they had different interests, they decided to support the Ottoman Empire against Russia. And so the Ottoman Empire, with the aid of France and the aid of Great Britain, was able to win this war. They didn't really win the war. What happened was that the Russians, the Crimean Peninsula had a population of Tatars who were Muslims. And this area was claimed by the Ottoman Empire because the Tatars were Muslims like the Turks. And so most of the war of the Crimean War was fought on the Crimean Peninsula. The Tatars have always been a problem for the Russians. In fact, during World War II, Stalin ordered thousands of them to be expelled from the peninsula. But anyway, so the war was fought in the Crimea, and basically Russia just ran out of money and troops. So basically, when Russia got tired and had suffered tremendous casualties, they decided to pull out of the war. So the war really ended with a stalemate, with the Russians unable to advance, but the Ottoman Empire holding firm thanks to the aid of Great Britain and France.
Isn't that where the Charge of Light Brigade was?
Yeah, the Charge of Light Brigade. Also, the Red Cross was born in the Crimean War. Florence Nightingale. One of the tragedies of the Crimean War was that more people died of disease and sickness than died of war wounds during this conflict. Because it was a very bloody war, even though it only lasted a couple of years. Now, what happened after this war? Well, a couple things. First of all, Napoleon III really was hailed as this great champion of liberalism and nationalism, and it was Napoleon III who prevailed upon the Ottoman Empire to grant Moldavia and Wallachia independence. In fact, those two principalities were combined, and the new country of Romania was born. Romania won its independence, its autonomy from the Ottoman Empire, and it was thanks to the diplomacy of Napoleon III. So Napoleon III came out of the war as this great champion of liberalism, nationalism. He had helped bring about the independence of Romania after centuries of Ottoman conquest, and another thing happened in this war. Another thing happened in this war was that Austria did not support Russia. You see, Austria and Russia, they're supposed to be pals. They're supposed to be buddies. But when this war broke out, Austria didn't say a word. And they did not stand behind Russia. And the Russians felt betrayed. Now, why wouldn't the Austrians stand beside Russians? I'll tell you why. Because part of the Ottoman Empire included a region called Transylvania. Now, Transylvania is not just the home of the legendary Dracula. Transylvania is also an area that was Romanian, but was ruled by the Habsburg Empire. It was ruled by the Hungarian minority that lived in Transylvania. So, see, one reason why the Habsburgs didn't jump in the defense of the Russians is because the Russians had been supporting the independence of the Romanians, the Wallachians and the Moldavians, and the Austrian Empire was thinking, hey, if they support their independence, they might support the independence of the Romanians that we rule. You know? So the Habsburgs didn't say a word. Now, what does this all have to do with Italy? I'll tell you what it has to do with Italy. First of all, Cavour looked around and said, look, the Habsburg Austrians and the Russians, they're a little alienated from each other. So if I go to war against the Austrians, the Russians aren't going to help them. See? So that's number one. Number two, Napoleon III is now Mr. Champion of liberalism and nationalism. Maybe he'll be willing to help us, the Italians, win our independence, since that seems to be his goal, you know, his image that he wants to project. So that's what he did. Now, one thing that I wanted to mention in Russian history, another event of the Crimean War was that Alexander II, when he succeeded his father, Nicholas, he was a little bit more liberal than his father had been, and he believed that the one reason why the Crimean War had been lost was because of serfdom. Because under the system of serfdom, whenever the Russian Empire drafted serfs into the army, they had to pay a cash payment to the owners of the serfs, because they were like slaves. So one of the reasons why he supported the emancipation of the serfs in 1861 is because it would allow the peasants to be recruited into the Russian military. And he really wanted to expand the size and scope of the military, and by freeing the serfs and making them into free peasants, he hoped to be able to, one of the requirements for them to be free was that they had to serve in the military. They became open for the draft. So there was a huge Russian draft. So he didn't do it so much because of the ideals of liberalism as much as he saw emancipating the serfs as a way to expand the size and scope of the Russian army. And it did, because leading up to World War I, one of the things that Russia was seen as so powerful is because they could draft millions of peasants into the army at a moment's notice, because such a system was set up when they emancipated the serfs in 1861. Now, also, though, another thing that Alexander did, he tried to make government less autocratic, kind of allow for more freedom and more local government. And when this resulted in a huge, once he started to allow for a little bit of freedom, there was a huge uprising in Poland in 1863 by the Poles, who didn't want to be ruled by the Russians, and it was only brutally crushed by about 250,000 Russian troops moving into the region and taking over the area. I mentioned this, I wanted to bring this up today, especially because, in Poland and in Lithuania and in Eastern Europe, there's a lot of fear right now. Because if you look at the history of Russia, even before they were communists, the Russians were sending thousands of troops here and thousands of troops there, and because that seems to be in their blood. We have to conquer, we have to be the dominant, we are God's chosen people. That seems to be a theme among the Russians. So even today, NATO is building up its troops in Lithuania, Poland, because hey, look at Russian history. If they see a problem, they send 100,000 troops to kill everybody. They did in 1863. Anyway, but at that time, Poland was actually part of the Russian Empire, so it was seen as a rebellion, and the Russians went in and crushed it in 1863. But anyway, I just wanted to mention it. Now, getting back to France and Italy. So what happened is Cavour, he goes to Napoleon III and said, look, you want to be a champion of liberalism and nationalism, this is your chance. You help us against Austria, and I'll do what we can for you. So when Napoleon III said, he said, look, I like this. This is what's going to happen. I'm going to help you defeat the Habsburgs. And then what you're going to do is there's a bunch of little principalities that are part of the Habsburg Empire that are located in central Italy. I have a cousin. And I want to make him king of central Italy. So you could have the Habsburg possessions in northern Italy, and that can be your kingdom of northern Italy. But the price will be that you have to give up these little principalities in central Italy, and that will be a separate kingdom that will belong to a nephew of mine. I think it's a cousin or a nephew, one of his relatives. So that was the deal. And Camille Cavour said, sure, yeah, sounds like a plan. That's what we'll do. So in 1859, that was in 1858 that they had this alliance between Napoleon III of France and the Kingdom of Sardinia, negotiated by Cavour. So in 1859, what happened was that the French armies, allied with the Kingdom of Sardinia, they invaded Italy and attacked the Habsburgs of Austria in northern Italy. And they won battle after battle. You know, Napoleon III was just, you know, kind of imitating his more famous uncle, the great Napoleon. And eventually, though, even though he was winning every battle, and Napoleon III was looked like he could just march anywhere he wanted to go, in 1859, he suddenly stopped his campaign and ended the war, and allowed the Habsburgs to retain control of northeastern Italy, the port of Venice. Now you might ask yourself, why would Napoleon, all of a sudden, even though he's winning every battle and sweeping to victory, why would he all of a sudden decide to end the war? Well, you see, things weren't going as planned. See, what happened was this. When Napoleon's armies were victorious in northern Italy, and the Habsburgs were in retreat, what happened in many parts of Italy, in northern Italy, was that there were instantaneous revolutions. You know, the local authorities, they didn't want to be ruled by the Habsburgs, so they turned around and they welcomed the. They wanted to be ruled by the Kingdom of Sardinia. And another thing that happened is that in some of the areas that belonged to the papacy, there were some parts of Italy that were part of the Pope's regime. Those areas revolted as well. Now this was a problem for Napoleon III, because you see, he had been supporting the Papal State. The French Republic French government had been supporting the Papal States for years, and so that created a problem domestically for Napoleon III. And then another thing is Cavour. This is what Cavour did when he heard that in parts of Italy there were like rebellions and protests and people asking to be taken over by the Kingdom of Sardinia. He sent troops to those areas and occupied them. Now, those are areas, some of these were areas that were supposed to be given to France, but Cavour just went ahead and occupied them anyway, right? So from the point of view of Napoleon III, it was like this guy was not doing his deal. You know, a deal had been made, and Cavour was kind of not holding out his part of the deal. He was occupying areas that were supposed to be given to Napoleon. So anyway, that's why Napoleon, even though he was winning every battle, decided to have the Truce of Villafranca in 1859 and end the war. So this is what happened. Cavour said, look, these things happen. You know, the guys came in there, and I had to support them, but I'll give you something in return. So what happened is that in 1860, an agreement was struck where, because central Italy wasn't given to Napoleon, the French were given Savoy and the port of Nice. Now, Savoy and Nice had traditionally been part of Italy. Savoy was the homeland of the House of Savoy that ruled the Kingdom of Sardinia. Now, as part of the deal that was struck in 1860, to make up for the lands that were not given to Napoleon, Nice and Savoy were transferred to France in 1860. And that satisfied Napoleon III. Now, Napoleon III, he couldn't really say, give me central Italy, because that's what you promised, because that would make him look bad, because he's supposed to be the champion of nationalism and liberalism. And who would he be to seize a big chunk of Italy when he's supposed to be the champion of nationalism? Well, anyway, so through his diplomacy and his back deals and his exchanges and trading, Cavour was able to unite most of northern Italy, which was now called the Kingdom of Italy, under Victor Emmanuel, the King of Sardinia. So the Kingdom of Sardinia became the King of Italy. Now this is where it got crazy. where all of a sudden things happened that nobody had expected. There was this man, a revolutionary of revolutionaries by the name of Giuseppe Garibaldi. Now, Garibaldi was actually, I think he was from Nice, but anyway, he was an Italian nationalist and a revolutionary, and this guy, if there was a revolution, he was there fighting. He was always wearing red, and he was just Mr. Revolution. And he was a disciple of Mazzini. Remember, Mazzini was dead by now, but the idea, he was a man who wanted to see Italy united. And Italy united under a republic. You know, he was the enemy of kings. You know, he was Garibaldi. He was just a revolutionary by nature. You know, if he heard about a revolution, he was there. When there was fighting in Latin America, he's there. There's another war here, he's there. He was like a professional revolutionary. Now, when he heard what was going on in Italy, this is what he did. He got together 1,000 crazy guys, 1,000 Italian nationalists like himself, the 1,000 they were called, and they landed in Sicily. And he landed in Sicily. Now, Garibaldi was not a religious man, but he knew that the peasants of Sicily were. So he started saying, he didn't actually say he was Jesus, but he had the beard, he went around riding a donkey, and, you know, he projected this image. This is the Christ has returned, a millennium is here. And all these peasants were like, oh, they're throwing palms at him, and he's like riding in there, yes, revolution, revolution. You know, didn't think he was Jesus, but he knew that a lot of peasants. And he made all these promises. You support the revolution, and all the land of the aristocrats will be given to you. Everybody will have land. You know, and everybody's like, oh, yes, this is the greatest thing since sliced bread. You know, and revolution spread across Sicily. And thousands of people were supporting him. And then he marched over into Naples, and everywhere he went, you know, the peasants were like, yay, and crowds were cheering. And the government of Francis II, he was the Bourbon king, his government completely collapsed. You know, he didn't know what to do because everybody was rallying behind Garibaldi. He was going to bring revolution to Italy. Well, Cavour was looking at these things and saying, oh, great. Revolution, that's all we need. A bunch of peasants thinking some guy's Jesus and wanting land. We don't need this. This is bad. So what he did is he told Cavour, Cavour told Victor Emmanuel, he said, you get on a horse, you're a king, you get on a horse, and you tell them you're Jesus. He didn't say that, but just you go down there, you're Victor Emmanuel, you're the king of Italy, you march down there with an army, and you need to take charge of the situation. So Victor Emmanuel said, I can do that. So Victor Emmanuel gets on his horse, gets an army, he marches south, and when they got there, see, Garibaldi everybody knew he was a revolutionary. Everybody knew that he was a radical. And he had his own army and all these peasants supporting him. And here comes Victor Emmanuel coming down south into southern Italy. Now, there was a fear that at this particular point, the whole unification of Italy project might be derailed if Garibaldi and Victor Emmanuel ended up fighting against each other, right? But Garibaldi did not want to see the unification of Italy collapse. So instead of fighting Victor Emmanuel, when Victor Emmanuel approached, he got off his horse and he bowed. Here's a man who's always been a revolutionary and a radical, and then he gets off his horse and he bows and says, "You, Victor Emmanuel, are king of Italy." You know, and everybody's like, "Whoa, that's crazy." You know, but it was a symbolic gesture. It was a way of saying Garibaldi was saying, "Hey, I want to see Italy united, and I'm willing to sacrifice my own principles to achieve that goal." So he recognized Victor Emmanuel as king. The combined forces of Garibaldi and Victor Emmanuel combined as a single army, and thus the regime of Francis II, the last Bourbon king of the two Sicilies, his regime collapsed, and Italy was now united. At least northern Italy and Naples and Sicily in 1860. Little story. How many people have had a margarita pizza before? You had a margarita pizza? I learned this. It's named after Queen Margherita, who was the wife of Victor Emmanuel. So it's a symbolic. It's a Naples pizza. You know, because he's Victor Emmanuel, the king of northern Italy, and they made that southern pizza in honor of the queen. You know, so it's a symbol of Italian unification. Next time you eat a margarita pizza, you can think Italian unification. Victor Emmanuel, Queen Margherita. You know. like the bagel we talked about from the Vienna and John Sobieski. Anyway.
If they can remember the pizza.
What?
If they can remember eating pizza.
Yeah, when you eat the margarita pizza, think Italian unification. All right. Anyway, it's real. I didn't used to like this. I'm not a big fan of tomatoes, but I like margarita pizzas.
It's like the herbal pizza in it.
Yeah, it's got a lot of basil in it.
Yeah.
Because in southern Italy, it's a lot like Greece, and they have a lot of those plants, those herbs and stuff that grow down there.
Machiavelli's in Bristol has the best margarita.
Oh. All right. So now and this is another thing that Cavour did. You see, Cavour wasn't. Cavour liked the constitution that had been set up in Italy. He liked the fact that you had the constitution that he had that only gave the right to vote to the very wealthy. And once he had united all of Italy, there was talk about writing a new constitution and talk about drafting a new constitution. Cavour would have none of that. So what he basically did, he said, look, the constitution we have now is fine. We don't need a new constitution. So what he did is he sent troops out to Italy. And he said, okay, our troops are going to organize an election. And people are going to vote on the current constitution and say yay, or, well, we have armies there. And, now listen, if you go to a region and you have the army organizing the election, and the soldiers are there at the polls, you're going to vote the way the army tells you. Otherwise, you're going to be scared. And so Cavour realized that. So he had these elections, but the elections were set up in such a way, since they were run by his army, that Italy voted by a large majority in support of this constitution that was so conservative, that gave the right to vote to only the wealthy, and set up a system where there was no local government, that all the provinces of Italy were appointed from the central government, so there was no local assemblies. And the system was set up in such a way that Cavour's government in northern Italy would dominate the rest of Italy. And it wasn't long after this that a lot of Italians realized that that was the case. And one of the legacies of Italian unification is that southern Italy always felt like they were second-class citizens, because the system was set up in such a way to give the government who was located up in northern Italy basically more power and authority to govern. And before we judge Italy, we should remember that the United States did the exact same thing after the Civil War. After the Civil War, the Union troops went in there and held all these elections, but they didn't allow slave owners or former Confederate soldiers to even vote. And so basically Reconstruction governments in the South after the Civil War, which is not too far distant for this, were all done at the point of a gun. All those Reconstruction governments. Now we think of it as a good thing because it gave the right, it passed the 13th and the 14th and the 15th Amendment were all added to the Constitution, and these guaranteed the right to vote and for all Americans, and got rid of slavery. And so we all think of this as a good thing, but it was done at the point of a gun. The Southerners weren't like, yes, all of a sudden we all are support freedom for Black people and equal rights. That wasn't the case at all. It was all done through a strong federal government moving in there, using the troops, and basically eliminating anybody who opposed them by not allowing them to vote. And so what the radical Republicans were doing in Reconstruction America post-Civil War was exactly the same thing that Italians did, Cavour did, post-unification, to ensure that you get the desired result. You send in the troops, you have the troops do the elections, that way you get the desired result you want to get. It happened just recently. Putin sends in all these Russian troops, and boy, the people of Crimea vote unanimously to be part of Russia. When you have troops and military forces running the polls, you're going to get the election result that you want. Now, it's important to remember that Italy was not just not all of Italy was part of this of Italy at this point. You had the Papal States still ruled by the Pope, thanks to French troops that were in the Papal States, and Venice still belonged to the Habsburg Empire. But what happened, and actually the first capital of Italy was Florence. That's why that's one reason why the official Italian that is taught in the schools is Tuscan Italian. The Italian, the dialect of Italian that was spoken in the area around Florence. That's what Italian is today. That's the language that they speak as official Italian, even though if you go to every part of Italy today, you'll find different dialects. And somebody from northern Italy still can't understand somebody from southern Italy. but when you learn Italian, you're learning Tuscan Italian, because Florence in Tuscany was the first capital of Italy. Now, what happened is the Italians took advantage of the Habsburgs' problems and the French problems to further unite Italy. For example, in 1866, when the Habsburgs were defeated by the Prussians, remember we talked about the 6-week war? Remember that the Habsburgs had their hands full. They had been defeated by Austria. They were dealing with a potential rebellion in Hungary. Well, it was in 1866 that Italian troops occupied Venice. Venetians don't really care too much for the rest of Italy. In fact, there's a movement in Venice today to declare their independence from the rest of Italy in the year 2014. But anyway, Venice was only annexed to Italy in 1866. It had been an independent republic or part of the Habsburg Empire for a long time before that, since the Middle Ages. Now, and then, remember during the war between France and Germany, between Germany and Napoleon III? See, Napoleon III, when he was facing a war against Germany, he decided to pull all the French troops out of Rome to fight against Germany. Well, see, that gave the Italians their opportunity. So they went in there and they occupied Rome, and Rome was incorporated into Italy. And it was only after 1870 that Rome became the capital of Italy, after Rome had been annexed. And that's why, to this day, the Vatican is its own separate government, but it's basically the area around St. Peter's. That's basically, the Vatican is an independent country, but it's basically this little enclave in the middle of Rome. But all the rest of Rome, that's all this, the Papal States at one time included all of central Italy, and now it's just basically, you can walk the distance of it in about 15 minutes. But that's how Rome became part of the United Italy. So you can see that Italy was united by 1870, but it wasn't ever done by revolution or by constituent assemblies or by a democratic process. It was done through war and diplomacy, through the diplomacy of Cavour, and then taking advantage of wars that other countries were fighting to advance their own interests. So that's how Italy became united altogether by 1870. All right, why don't we take a little break here, and then we'll talk a little bit more about mid-19th century revolution and reform and all that.
One quick question.
Yes?
That Cavour guy, he's not the guy on our study guide, is he?
He is the guy, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Is the French still
Now, what I wanted to talk about was the fact that if you look at the mid-19th century, events in Italy and events in Germany were not anomalies. They weren't the exceptions. You see that all throughout the Western world, especially, and that would include the Western Hemisphere, lands that were influenced by European history, you see the same phenomenon where liberalism and nationalism were still very powerful forces that inspired people, but to achieve those goals, it was done through state action. It wasn't done through wild-eyed grassroots protests in the streets, barricades in the streets, violence. It was done through political action, through laws, through war, through government. Just to give you an example, the American Civil War. The American Civil War, it was a revolutionary war. People don't realize that. I mean, if you look at the Civil War from an American point of view, you can see it as this very special event. But looking at it through the eyes of world history, you can see it that it was really a revolutionary war, because in the sense, throughout history, throughout its very beginning, the United States had been run by slave owners. I mean, most of the first presidents of the United States were slave owners. I mean, the non-slave owners were the exception. So almost every president before Lincoln, with the exception of maybe John Quincy Adams and John Adams, they were slave owners. And slave owners in the South dominated local government, and they were the ones who were in the Senate and in the Congress. And so basically, up until the mid-19th century, slave owners were the dominant political force in American politics. But because of the market revolution, what had happened in places like New York and the New England and the Northeast, industrialists and people who made their living off of banking and trade, their wealth and their power had grown. You got to remember that even as late as the mid-19th century, 2/3 of America's richest men were slave owners. So the way to make lots of money in America was to own a plantation worked by slaves. So now you got to remember that the victory in the Civil War was a victory for the middle class. It was a victory for people who made their living off of trade and industry and manufacturing. That class won a victory over the planter class. Now the planter class had adopted a lot of the point of view of English aristocracy. They acted like aristocracy. They treated the white trash as like second-class citizens. You know, the non-slave owners who were whites. That's what they called them, white trash, for a reason, because they were like scum in their view. They were the planters. You know, we are the elites. You know, we run this country. We have our slaves. It's their natural place to be our slaves, and that was just their kind of point of view. And the American Revolution was a victory for an emerging middle class that made its living off of trade and manufacturing industry rather than off of agriculture. And also, a lot of the American Revolution was inspired not only by the principles of liberalism, but by nationalism. Most of the Americans who fought in the American Civil War were not fighting to free the slaves. Some of them were. But most of them were fighting to keep a strong, united America. Most of the Union troops who fought in the American Civil War were fighting for a unified America. They saw the succession of the South as a threat to the future safety and greatness of the United States of America. And so most of the Americans who fought and died in the Civil War, most of them didn't give a hoot about slaves or freeing the slaves or abolition. Most of them were fighting out of a true sense of patriotism, that the Union was sacred, and that fighting for the Union and preserving the United States was a wonderful, great thing, because they were patriots who loved their country and wanted to see America continue to grow and prosper and expand. So the Civil War was and can be seen as a generally Western civilization trend toward the ideals of nationalism and liberalism. And then another thing, we already mentioned how basically after the war was over and after the South had been occupied by Union troops, the victorious North used the exact same strategies that Cavour used in Italy, in southern Italy, to implement their ideas, using armies to oversee elections to get the desired result. And in fact, the period of Reconstruction from 1865 to 1877 was really a period of occupation where Union troops occupied basically what was their view a foreign country, the South. Now, but from our point of view today, we see these things as wonderful because at the point of the bayonet, we established the 14th Amendment that gives equal rights to all citizens, the 15th Amendment that guarantees the right to vote to all citizens. Those 14th and 15th Amendments were only ratified in the southern states at the point of a gun. And it wasn't like the Southerners were like, oh yeah, we practice slavery, and now we're not. We want to see equality for African Americans. No, it wasn't like that at all. They were forced to because guns were put to their heads. They had no choice. And that's why ultimately those 14th and 15th Amendments didn't really do anything. It took 100 years till the 1950s and 60s before those ideals actually were put into effect, because when you try to force something down people's throat against their will, they're going to react against it. And that's what happened in the South. After the armies left in the 1870s, when the Union troops pulled out of the South, the southern states took action and put into effect the system of segregation that reduced the freedmen, the former slaves, to second-class citizenship, because they had never been on board from the first place to accept Africans as their equals. And that's why it took 100 years before the ideals of the 14th and 15th Amendments were actually put into effect through in the 1950s and 1960s in the United States. And the same thing happened in Italy. When the Union troops occupied the South, one way that the Southerners reacted against being occupied was to form secret societies to wage secret wars against the occupation armies, and they were called the Ku Klux Klan. Now, the Ku Klux Klan would metamorphose into a racist organization, purely racist organization, after World War I, or during World War I. But in the 1870s, it was basically an organization that fought a guerrilla war against the Union occupation. Now, in southern Italy, they did the same thing. It's called the Mafia. People don't realize that the Mafia was founded in Italy by Italians who were tired of being told what to do by northern Italians. And they wanted to exercise local control. So, of course, to make money, they went into illegal activities. And they were engaged in illegal activities. That's how the Mafia became like the secret government of Sicily and Italy. Of course, when Italians, by the millions, migrated to the United States in the late 19th century, they brought the Mafia with them. But the Mafia is actually part of the same historical phenomenon as the Ku Klux Klan. It was organized as a way for locals to protest and to stage opposition to what was, in their view, a government imposed from beyond, an unjust government, as they saw. And obviously, the Ku Klux Klan and the Mafia went similar ways. They both became criminal organizations that were eventually banned and prosecuted. All right. Now, so in another area of the world where you can see these ideas being played out is in England. The period of the 19th century, most of the mid and late 19th century, is known as the age of Queen Victoria. Now, she was the queen, and there's a picture of her. She was the queen at the time, and she was somebody who was a very good person, but really wasn't actively involved in the government on a day-to-day basis. So she really was more of a figurehead. You still had a system in place where you'd have elections, and the party that had the most votes would choose the prime minister who would organize the government. Now, the 19th century was a political battle in England between two political parties. You had the Whig Party, which was seen as the Liberal Party, and it was led by a man by the name of William Gladstone. William Gladstone, I wish we had leaders like this. You know what William Gladstone did for fun when he was a kid? He would translate Greek into Latin and Latin into Greek. That's what he did for fun. He was a genius. He was a great statesman, and his big opponent was a man by the name of Disraeli. I don't have his picture up there now. Disraeli was actually a Jewish man, but he had become the leader and spokesman of the Conservative or Tory party, and it represented the interests of the landed aristocracy. It's kind of interesting that a man who came from a family of Jewish merchants would become the spokesperson for English landowning aristocrats, but so be it. So Disraeli and Gladstone, they were always debating each other, and they kind of took turns being prime minister at this particular period. But one of the big issues that they fought over was expanding the right to vote. And for example, Gladstone, who had the support of a lot of working people, he wanted to expand the right to vote to all city people, all people living in the cities. But this is where Disraeli did an end run around. Disraeli looked around and he saw events going on in Europe. He saw what Bismarck had done in Germany. He saw what Napoleon III had done in France, and he realized, if you give peasants, people in the countryside, the right to vote, they'll vote for aristocrats because they're conservative. They have kind of a natural deference for the elites, for the aristocracy. How many people have seen seen that show, Downton Abbey. Anybody watch that show? There's nobody watches it. I use it as an analogy, but for whatever reason, in a lot of European societies, people in rural areas tend to be a lot more friendly and supportive of the aristocracy than people living in the towns. You know, the working men living in the towns, they kind of have this kind of view of the aristocrats as being kind of lazy and nasty, but that wasn't true of the country folk as much. There was more of a friendly relationship, probably because aristocrats had more interaction with peasants at that time. But anyway, but what Disraeli did was he proposed the Reform Act of 1867. And now a lot of, and under this Reform Act of 1867, it gave the right to vote to all Englishmen. So it expanded the right to vote to all adult males, basically. And that would include peasants. And the reason why Disraeli supported it is because he realized that if you give these peasants, these agricultural laborers, the countryside, the right to vote, they'll vote for aristocrats. And the Conservative Party was the party of the landed aristocracy. And it worked. Now another thing that was going on was that this works into our theme of achieving liberal goals through state action, because the expanding the right to vote to all adult males was not done through revolutionary fervor or violence. It was done by the government taking action and expanding the right to vote through the passage of a law, the Reform Act of 1867. Now, another thing that happened at this time was that there was a big debate about the British Empire because remember you had parts of the British Empire that were not represented in the British Parliament and were distant. Like you had Australia, you had Canada, you had South Africa, you had Ireland. You had these parts of the British Empire that where the people who lived there really weren't represented at all in the British Parliament. And now there had been some debate among the British about what to do, and that was one of the debates between Disraeli and Gladstone was about what to do with these, and especially India. What do you do with all these lands? Is it right that the British should tell these people how to live their lives and not give them any kind of local autonomy? And there was a big debate. And during the American Civil War, for example, the Conservative Party supported the South, while the Liberal Party supported the North. And so these issues of liberalism and freedom and representative government, they continued to be debated in the British Parliament. Well, when it was all said and done, it was decided that maybe liberal principles ought to win out. So in 1867, Parliament passed a law that was very important in the history of the Western Hemisphere. They decided to grant Canada its independence. So there was actually, I don't know if you guys know this, but there was actually a revolt in Canada called the Mackenzie Rebellion in 1839. And in the 1860s, there was a rebellion in what is today Manitoba by French Canadians and Indians trying to seek their independence. So the Canadians weren't just all like, yeah, we love the British. You know, there were some Canadians who resented the fact that their government was under the control of the British Parliament. In fact, a lot of Ireland, there was a lot of opposition to British rule in Ireland, and there were these people called Fenians. They were Irish patriots who wanted to see an independent Ireland. Well, see, a lot of Fenians had come to the United States and as immigrants, and a lot of these Irishmen who were Fenians actually fought on the side of the Union during the American Civil War. Well, after the American Civil War, a lot of Fenians said, you know what, let's use Canada as a base to free Ireland. We'll seize control of Canada, and then we'll demand that Ireland be free. So there was actually these Fenians, a lot of them were Civil War veterans from the Union. We're going to use their skills that they developed during the American Civil War to try to liberate Canada and create like an Irish state in Ireland, because there were a lot of Irish immigrants who had moved to Canada. So given the fact that we had this situation, and there were a lot of Canadians who were unhappy with British rule, And by 1867, obviously the British were beginning to think that liberalism is a good idea, we need to expand on it. In 1867, the same year that they passed the Reform Act of 1867, they passed the Dominion of Canada Act in 1860. And what this law did was it gave, basically the British Parliament gave Canada its independence. It allowed them to organize themselves into a kind of a United States of Canada with a federal system. And under this system, the viceroy appointed by the Queen would be like the symbolic ruler of Canada, but it would have its own independent government. So Canada achieved autonomy and independence by this act, and it was seen as a great victory for liberalism. And that became the model for the British Empire in its other areas. In South Africa, any area of the British Empire where you had a substantial European population, the British did the same thing. So they did the same thing in 1872, they did it for South Africa. 1871, they did it for Australia. In all these parts of their empire, they granted local government and autonomy, allowing these people to have their own elections and their own government. And to this day, Australia and Canada are still technically ruled by the King of England. Not ruled, but Queen now. Queen Elizabeth II is the head of state, not only in England but in Australia and in Canada. She's like the constitutional monarch. Now the British Parliament, they could agree on those things, but one issue that became an issue that they could not agree on was Ireland, because you see, Ireland had a large. They were called the Anglo-Irish. They were Irish of English ancestry and Scotch-Irish ancestry who had moved to Ireland, and they wanted to be. They elected and they voted representatives into Parliament, but a lot of Irishmen who were Roman Catholic did not want to be part of England anymore. And so one of the big issues of the day was the issue of independence of Ireland, or even allowing them to have an autonomous government. And it was never resolved. And that's why it's still a sore point. That's why eventually when they granted Ireland its independence, or Ireland achieved its independence in 1921, the northern part of Ireland remained part of Great Britain, because in that part of the area there were enough people of Scottish and English ancestry who did not want to be part of a Roman Catholic independent Ireland. So that continued to be a sore point. Now, another area, we're going to close here, another area that we see all these kind of developments taking place is Mexico. See, in Mexico, remember we already talked about Santa Anna being the Caudillo, being the dictator. But you see, remember in Mexico, you had a situation where the Creole population, the people of European blood, were the ones who were calling the shots. And the system was rigged in such a way that the large landowners of European ancestry dominated the government, and people who were of mixed blood, the mestizos, I don't know how to say it, I don't know my Spanish, but people who were of mixed Native American and European blood, and people who were purely of Indian blood, they basically were disenfranchised. Now, there was a man by the name of Benito Juarez, I got his picture here, who was kind of considered to be kind of like compared to Abraham Lincoln. He was mestizo. My Spanish is terrible, but he was a man of mixed blood, and he became a champion for expanding the right to vote in government and the right to speak for the people, for the commoners, or for the people of Indian blood and of mixed blood. And in fact, this struggle for political rights resulted in a war called the Mexican War of Reform, and eventually the people who wanted to expand the right to vote to Indians, they won the day, thanks to the leadership of Benito Juarez. Now, but the conservative forces of Mexico, they weren't too happy with the situation, and they wanted to be restored to power. And they found a champion, believe it or not, in Napoleon III. Napoleon III wanted to expand French influence in Latin America, so what he proposed was that a Habsburg by the name of Ferdinand Maximilian, that he should be put in place as the Emperor of Mexico. Now, the reason why he did this is because, remember, Napoleon III was trying to court the Roman Catholic Church, and one of the marks against Benito Juarez and his new government was that it was seen as anti-Roman Catholic Church. because the church had been, the land had been seized, and the church was seen as allied with the conservative forces. So Napoleon III, who, even though he was a champion of liberalism, he also was a champion of the Roman Catholic Church. That was part of his regime. So he wanted to restore the Roman Catholic Church in Mexico, extend French influence in Mexico, take out a reaching hand to the Habsburgs of Austria. And so with French troops, Ferdinand Maximilian was installed as the Emperor of Mexico, and he had the support of the conservatives and the Catholic Church in Mexico. And now, in fact, when the French armies first arrived in 1862, they were actually defeated on the 5th of May, Cinco de Mayo. That's now a holiday. Now, it's kind of interesting that's a holiday in Mexico because even though they won that battle, they lost the war because the French eventually did occupy the country and take it over and govern Mexico and kind of prop up Ferdinand Maximilian of Mexico. And he, in fact, was Austrian in blood. But anyway, so, but what happened, though, was that one reason why Napoleon III was able to put this into effect is because this all was happening when the United States was occupied with the American Civil War, and the United States couldn't really object to French expanding its influence in the region. So Napoleon III was taking advantage of the fact that the Civil War America was occupied. He saw an opportunity to expand French influence in the region. But eventually, we're almost done. But eventually Maximilian met his end. His government was overthrown by the forces of liberalism. He ended up being shot. He was shot by a firing squad in 1867, and that was the end of that. So again, liberalism, the ideas of liberalism were achieved in Mexico by war, by state action, by the defeat of Maximilian, and a new government being installed that had the support of the indigenous populations of Mexico. All right, so that in a nutshell is what we've covered. What we're going to do is take the exam on Tuesday. And if you have any questions about the exam, don't hesitate to email, call, or talk to me at your house.